My name is Taylor Ann Benthal, and I will be presenting my research on whether or not small groups really can make a big difference in student success and the effects of small and whole group teaching. The purpose of the study was to determine which teaching method was the most effective, using only whole group teaching, using only small group teaching, or combining the two of those methods and using them together. For so long, administrators have been saying that whole group teaching is outdated, and that is back from when when educators were teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, and that we shouldn't be using that method anymore. So I wanted to figure out if there was a pattern among the data, and whether or not whole group teaching was really as bad as it's made out to be, and whether or not small group teaching is really as effective as people think it is. As an educator, I personally wanted to know this so then I could figure out which method would be best to teach my students with. I wanted to figure this out so then I could help my lower students succeed, as well as helping my higher students succeed and challenging all of the students at the same time. With that, it helps me become a better teacher because then I feel more accomplished and I understand what works for students, what doesn't work for students, and how to tweak that as each year goes on. Some background information on small group teaching was done during a literature review with about 8 to 9 sources. I focused on the main 4 or 5 sources and how their reviews have helped connect to small group and whole group teaching. The first author that I read about was Finley, and he wrote his article originally in 2014 and then rewrote and republished his article in 2015. Now, Finley has a very interesting idea on small group teaching. He felt that small group teaching is the most effective when teachers create constructivist experiences for students. With this being said, he wants teachers to be creating unique and intriguing experiences for students so it can help them learn more. And by doing this, by creating these interesting experiences, students remember the content more on a year-to-year basis, and they remember it when they go home. They want to tell their parents about it, their grandparents, their siblings. They want to keep researching and keep studying it, so they're more engaged in the lessons in school and out of school. This was interesting because then I had also read an article written by Fontes and Pinnell in 2010, and they stated that research has demonstrated that small group instruction helps students improve achievement. So by creating these constructivist experiences, these small groups are in the end supposed to be more effective than just using whole group teaching, which connected highly with the study and determining if there was research out there to support whole group teaching or small group teaching. Moving on from that, Finley concluded in his article that a productive struggle is necessary for students to learn. And by productive struggle, he means allowing students to fail once or twice and then succeeding on their own. And by failing, it doesn't mean watching a student get F's the entire time. It means if they're trying to add and subtract the numbers 1 through 20 using a tens frame and it's just not working for them, they themselves are able to determine that manipulatives work better for them, or getting a piece of paper and a pencil and drawing a picture. They find what works for them. This is that productive struggle that he's talking about that goes back to small group teaching. And the productive struggle connects to small group teaching because educators have the chance to model better for students when they are teaching 4 or 5 students at a time versus teaching 20 students. And the students that are struggling most of the time don't want to talk up in class in fear of being made fun of or being embarrassed. So their questions usually go unanswered and they continue to be confused throughout the whole rest of the lesson. By using small groups, teachers can target and differentiate students' needs more versus whole groups. And that's what Fontes and Pinnell and Finley were all concluding in their articles. Moving on to the next article that was very interesting. This was written by Paredes in 2018. And Paredes, she concluded that when interest is built in the classroom, it allows for learning to take place at home. And she studied an educator performing a science lesson in their classroom. What the educator did was they introduced the science standards ahead of time and then allowed students to take that science information with them home and create their own science experiments. There were some guidelines for this study though. The students had about 20 different science experiments that they could choose from, and they had to pick 6 of them and create them with their family members at home and then bring them back to school to compete in a science fair. Now, Paredes found that most of the families involved had both parents involved in the actual science experiment creating process. None of the parents involved or any family members had a family member in a science field, but at the end of the survey, every student but one stated that they wanted to go into a science field type profession once they got older. And this was interesting because the teacher was teaching the science standards in a small group setting, so this was creating the interest to go back to that constructivist experience that Finley was talking about. The 2 articles were connecting by the Paredes found that the educator was creating interest in school to make students want to continue their learning outside of school in a non-formal way. With that, Paredes found at the end of their article that a student having control over one's learning is necessary in order to have full engagement of a student and to have them putting the effort in. When a student has control over their learning, then they themselves want to do good for themselves or do better for themselves. They don't want to perform well to make their teacher happy. They want to perform well because they feel happy in the end. And this is what Paredes had concluded at the end of their article and the end of their research. The last article that really stuck out that needed to be talked about was written by Kayat Tecomel and Pudapek in 2013. Now they focus on student team achievement divisions, which they also referred to as STAD in their article as an acronym. And STAD is defined as when students are arranged into small groups comprised of those having high, medium, and low abilities. Therefore, members in a group have to assist, discuss questions, and audit each other. And what they mean here is that you have a high student and a low student, and you pair those students together and they go and work. And then you take your next highest and your next lowest and pair them together and they go and work. And you keep going and you keep matching the students up until you are left with a medium high and a medium low student and medium student. By doing this, the authors found an astronomical difference in their data. They did a pre-survey at the beginning or a pre-test at the beginning and then a pre-test at the end of the assessment or the end of the study on the content that was being taught, and they found astronomical differences and huge growth among the students. And these were done, this study was done, again, using a smaller group setting. It was the student pairs working with other student pairs to find out the information that they needed. The methodology employed, the study was taking place in a first grade classroom at R. Bruce Wagner Elementary School in Lakeland, Florida. This is a Title I school, and it is comprised of 90% low-income families. The state scores have been below average over the last couple of years, and they were actually one of the lowest scores last year at the end of the school year. The students, as stated before, there are 19 students in the class, but only 18 of the students actively participated in the study due to the fact that one of the students is pulled out for the entire reading, math, and science block during the day, so their data would not be accurate for this whole group, small group, and both teaching methods research. The subject that was taught was reading block, and the reading block is 2 hours and 15 minutes a day. Normally, what the administration allows is 30 minutes for a whole group in the morning, and then the whole rest of the reading block is supposed to be taught using small group teaching, which is why this was such an interesting topic for myself, as an educator and as somebody in the classroom, because my administration tells us all the time that small group teaching is more effective. So I wanted to see, did the data support that? There were 3 groups used. There was 3 different types of groups used. A control group, and this control group was taught using only whole group teaching. There were about 5 students in the group, and they were called Group 1. The whole group teaching method was taught for 30 minutes in the morning, and they were taught the reading comprehension standard, the grammar standard, the phonics skill, the new sight words, and anything else that may have been on the lesson plan for that day. And then they were sent to go complete their graphic organizer by themselves with their partners if they needed. Very rarely did the students go up to the teacher or talk to the teacher after they were sent off on their own. The next group was the small group, and this is considered this was referred to as Group 4. And Group 4 was taught using solely small group teaching, and the small group only learned in small group. When the other groups were in whole group teaching, the small group would go to the computer and use a mandated program that they have. They would practice some center work on their own, whether it was word work, phonics skills, sight words. They worked on their own until it was time to work on the actual reading standard with the teacher. And then the last 2 groups were using both methods. They were methods whole group and small group, and they were referred to as Groups 2 and Groups 3. And they were taught whole group with the whole group went off onto separate centers on their own, and then were pulled again with the teacher for small group teaching. The students were given a pre and a post survey at the beginning and end of the study to analyze their feelings towards school. They were asked 5 different questions. These questions were then turned into numbers to catalog the data, and this was very similar to a Likert scale, and that was considered quantitative and qualitative data. The graphic organizers were completed 1 a week for each student, and they were scored out of 100 points, so this was a quantitative piece of data as well. And then the last piece of data taken was anecdotal notes by the teacher, who also happened to be the researcher, and those were considered qualitative data, pieces of data as well. Moving on to the results, we're going to talk about the pre and the post survey first. The pre and the post survey were asked the same questions each time. There were 5 questions, and those questions were: how do you enjoy coming to school? How do you enjoy working/reading with a partner? How do you enjoy the stories that we read in class? How do you feel when reading out loud to the class? Or how do you feel when you are read to by the teacher or another student? The pre-survey showed that mostly every student was very excited to come to school, and you will see that on the next slide in a graph. This type of data is considered a Likert scale, which is referred to as a study that focuses solely on what people are interested in, what they're feeling, and people doing this know that their feelings are being analyzed. So the data also showed from the pre-survey that the students enjoyed being read to. They would rather have been read to than have to read out loud. And it was also found that the lowest students chose the lowest score for reading out loud. When they were choosing their scores, the students were given 3 options: a happy face, which also stood for 3 points, a straight face, which stood for 2 points, and then a sad face, which stood for 1 point. And these points were then cataloged and used for the data purpose of the survey, and the happy faces were used for the children, for the students, because they are in 1st grade, and that was something that they could easily connect with. Now, the post survey was very interesting because it was found that there were 4 students who marked enjoying coming to school lower than normal, and they explained why, saying that they were in trouble a lot or they were bored because they felt like they weren't learning something. That being said, the higher students also noted that they enjoyed reading out loud more than they were being read to, because the stories that were read to them are on their level and they are more than capable of reading the stories on their own. It's just that these are the stories mandated by the county. For the most part, other than that, the other 3 questions, their data stayed the same. And as you can see in this graph, the darker green is the pre-survey and the lighter green is the post-survey. And the pre-survey, as stated, question 1, do they enjoy coming to school, had that little bit of a difference. It was about a 2.9 and then a 2.7. Question 3 and 4 stayed the same, and those questions were Do you enjoy the stories that are read? And do you like coming to school? And as you can see, this overall, or do you enjoy reading out loud? And as you can see, this is just a lower result overall. So now moving on to the graphic organizers, these were scored out of 100 points, and the goal was for the students to obtain an 80% or higher to show that they thoroughly understood the standards that were being taught. Now, an example of these standards are main idea and key details. The students have to find 3 key details on their own to come up with the main idea or the big picture of the story that they had read. Now, this was very interesting, these results, because these are what really determined which method was the most effective method. And it showed that Group 1 had the highest average with a 92%, and Group 1 was taught using solely whole group teaching. The next highest average was Group 4 with an 88.9%, and they were taught using solely small group teaching. The 2 lowest groups were Groups 2 and 3, and they were taught using both whole and small group teaching. And they had an 86.8 and a 77.5%. That's about a 15-point difference amongst whole group teaching and both methods being used. From this data alone, we can conclude that whole group teaching was the most effective, but that does not mean small group teaching was ineffective, which we will cover in the conclusion in a second. Here we have a graph that shows the both groups method, or using both groups, was the lowest scoring, whereas using whole group was the highest scoring, and you could see the colors to match the groups on the top. This slide here also shows the scores for each student for each graphic organizer that they had to complete. Each student had to complete 1 graphic organizer a week for the course of 5 weeks, which is how long the study was, for a total of 5 grades total. And then the averages for the groups based off of the weeks are on the bottom. This is just to see the actual scores that the students were receiving. The last piece of data was the observational notes. Now, this was also very interesting, or the anecdotal notes taken by the teacher. This was also very interesting because these notes just talked about what went on in the day and who was absent, who was late. And the teacher found that there was at least 1 student late or absent every day, which is not uncommon for a Title I school and unfortunately very difficult to work around. There were as many as 7 students absent one day during the study. And there were many interruptions during the reading block, almost 2 to 3 times a week, whether it was for a fire drill that made them start their day late, whether it was for an early release day that made them squish everything together, chop half their lesson in half, and then end their day early. There was FSA testing that had gone on a few days, and FSA practice testing, so students had to change their schedule. And every Tuesday, the class went to the computer lab to work on a mandated county program. So there were many interruptions during the school day, preventing the teacher from actually teaching for 2 hours and 15 minutes every day during the reading block. It is important to note, though, every student was engaged for the most part during the lessons and in the stories. To conclude, we can tell based off of the data that whole group teaching was the most effective teaching method. And this is based solely off of the numbers. But we were seeing if small group teaching was as great as it was being made out to be by administrators and by researchers. And it's not to say that small group teaching is not ineffective, because small group teaching by itself was the next highest scoring method. So when used by themselves, they are very effective, but then when put together with this group of students, they were not very effective. And this can help teachers and educators in their own classrooms so that they can do this as well with their students to make them the most successful students that they can be. My action plan for next year is to change the way my reading block is set up. Now, this research was done in my classroom because I was very interested in it, and it could help my low students who are very low and they struggle. So my goal for next year is to change the way my reading block is set up and only teach using whole group or small group teaching. And I would determine what students go in these groups by getting to know them better at the beginning of the school year. So then I can determine, would a lower student who doesn't really like to read as much prosper working with 20 other students, or would they prosper working with 4 or 5 students? And my higher students, how would I challenge them more? Would I challenge them in whole group, or would I challenge them in small group? What would they be comfortable with, and what would they be able to connect with me with better so that they can make as many gains as possible? I would most likely put my struggling students in the small group using the pre and the post survey information, stating that the struggling students did not enjoy reading out loud as much as the higher students did. And then my more confident students would go into the whole group teaching so that they could get used to reading out loud and presenting to people as well. And then my other goal for the next school year would be to have less interruptions in my school day. Even though that's very difficult to do, that would be my biggest goal, because then we would actually be able to utilize the amount of time given to us for our reading block. And then here are the references from the literature reviews that I had talked about. Thank you.